Evelyn Zumaya reads Affairs Valentino.
I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of Affairs Valentino, and I want to read my book to you. From page 52, Chapter 3, Calling the Shots. 7 years later, November 26, 1926, George Allman's office in Los Angeles. B. Allman read the Los Angeles Times front page article titled, "Sheik's Shade Waits Cue," to her husband as he sorted his way through a towering stack of papers on his desk. Quote, Miss Hudnett, known on the stage as Natasha Rambova, arrived on the Homeric with George B. Weiner, who said he is a medium associated with the American Society for Physical Research. The gist of the screen star Rudolph Valentino's revelations concerning his activities since his death last August, as confided to Miss Rambova through the mediumship of Weiner at her chateau near Paris, follows. The medium said that while he was at Miss Rambova's chateau, he received a psychic message that Valentino was going to die. He also said that Valentino and Miss Rambova at one time conducted many seances. End quote. B paused in her morning read to say, "You really should call her, George." He mumbled a few unintelligible words in her direction and continued with his work at hand. Ignoring his lack of response, B returned to the article. Quote, Natasha Rambova alleges that the dead star has talked to her and that through the mediumship of Weiner, Valentino revealed that he is a citizen of the astral plane. There, Valentino met Enrico Caruso and has heard the late tenor sing. He's also visited theaters on the worldly plane where his pictures were being shown and has been pleased at the flattery he sensed in the minds of the audiences. He wishes that his will, which left nothing to Miss Rambova, be carried out as executed and believed this will be done. End quote. George was not surprised to hear Natasha had publicly acknowledged she and Rudy participated in seances, or that she made her admission with her trusty psychic by her side. He knew he should call Natasha while she was in New York, but also knew he was unlikely to do so any time in the near future. In the 2 months since Rudy's death, he and Natasha had not exchanged a single word of communication. "I'll call her after the auction," George assured his wife. "I just don't have time right now." This was an accurate assessment on his part, for by the end of November 1926, George Allman was in deep over his head, managing Rudy's business, and his workdays were only growing longer. A great deal of his time was spent processing a surging paper trail. Prior to Rudy's death, all of his correspondence, both business and personal, was directed to the attention of his last employer, United Artists Studios, where it was processed by an efficient mailroom staff. Following his death, the thousands of letters addressed to Rudolph Valentino, Rudy, the Sheik, Rudolph Valentino Productions, and Mr. George Allman were all delivered directly to George's office. Morning sacks of mail, crammed with letters from Rudy's grieving fans, were heaved against George's office door. He was acutely aware these letters represented the foundation of his success or failure as the executor of Rudy's estate, and with this in mind he gave each one careful consideration. He accomplished this monumental task with the assistance of B and his secretary, Clara Trask. The letters, and more letters contained every conceivable enclosure, from mass cards and tear-stained pages of poetry to photographs, locks of hair, and intensely personal revelations, such as, quote, Dear Rudolph, I have been wicked, and I shall never go to heaven if you do not pray for me. Pray for me, Rudolph dear saint. For you and I, we know there was no love like ours, and when my husband takes me in silence, I cry your name. It is your heart beating against my full breast that I feel, not his. End quote. A few of the letters even contained disturbing threats of suicide. Rudy, my life is an empty void. Send me a sign that you want me in heaven, and I will join you there. Along with such desperate pleas, George was receiving legitimate requests to rename colleges, mountains, rivers, and state parks in Rudy's honor. Sculptor Alessandro Gabaliere petitioned George for a commission to create an official Rudolph Valentino memorial statue. The letters and requests followed no stock format and ran the gamut from eloquently composed messages on expensive stationery to scrawled misspellings on scraps of paper. One missive asked George to grant his personal endorsement of a, quote, home Valentino shrine, which included a small framed photo of Rudy, a candle, a stick of incense, and a thin liturgical pamphlet. Whether the letters were from Rudy's fans in England or America, their individual presentation held little relevance, as the message was always the same: love for Rudolph Valentino and despair over his passing. Some of the most unsettling letters were those from women claiming they had given birth to Rudy's love children. In the few months since Rudy's death, George had opened more than a dozen announcements of various Valentino offspring, with some of the letters even including a photo of the tot in question. The additional business correspondence relating to the settlement of Rudy's estate added considerably to the volume of mail being processed. The official appraisal of the Valentino estate had just been completed, and on November 12th, the public notice of his death was issued to his creditors. The race to demand payment began, and invoices and requests for immediate remittance began pouring into George's office. On the same morning that Bea read news of Natasha's return from France, George opened over 30 requests for payment from Rudy's creditors. Included in the morning mail that day were invoices from the Excel Electric Company, Western Hay and Grain, the Sun Lumber Company, the California Yacht Club, the Los Angeles Marble and Tile Company, Standard Oil, and Murphy Motors. The not-so-pretty picture of Rudy's dire financial situation at the precise moment of his death lay strewn on George's desk, a story told by a great deal of money owed. Despite this grim reality, George remained optimistic. He had scheduled the first estate auction to take place on December 10th at the Hall of Art Studios in Hollywood, and was confident this single event would generate ample funds for the estate reserves. But as George ripped into invoice after invoice, he could not shake a sense of dread that this growing heap of unpaid bills might just be the tiniest tip of an iceberg. Perhaps the true extent of Rudy's indebtedness still loomed well beneath the surface. And on this busy morning, George's check writing, accounting, and correspondence perusal was interrupted by a call from the manager of the Ambassador Hotel on Wilshire Boulevard. It seemed that Rudy's brother Alberto was on the premises and requesting the lease of a luxury bungalow. The hotel manager explained he was telephoning George for a guarantee that Mr. Alberto Guglielmi Valentino would be able to pay the steep monthly rent of $750. Without a second of hesitation, George replied curtly, "I'm not vouching for any such thing right now." Suspecting that Alberto's attorney, Milton Cohen, had accompanied him to the Ambassador Hotel, George asked the hotel manager to put Mr. Guglielmi's representative on the line. Sure enough, Milton Cohen answered. "Milton," George asked, "why don't you and Alberto meet me at Hollywood Jack's in a half an hour, and we'll work this out. I've got another idea I want to run by you anyway." George hung up the telephone and relayed Alberto's request to his wife. She seemed less surprised than her husband to hear of Alberto's desire to secure a prestigious Ambassador Hotel address, and reminded George that Pola Negri maintained her own bungalow on the Ambassador's grounds. Perhaps, Bea mused, Pola was about to ensconce Alberto in a bungalow next door. George agreed this might be the case, and added that he was fast reaching the end of his long rope where Alberto was concerned. He was not looking forward to his next face-to-face with the man at Hollywood Jack's. In anticipation of the conversation, he placed a quick telephone call to his own attorney, Leonard Wilson, and asked him to attend the meeting. With a potentially contentious exchange with Alberto Valentino only hours away, George returned to the endless processing of the morning mail. Although reading through the Daily Mail was time-consuming, this was the only aspect of George's role as Rudy's executor that was not crawling with legal complications. The fulfillment of the promise George made to Rudy, assuring him he would settle his estate, grew exponentially more daunting with each passing day. And there was scarcely a moment when George's profound grief at the tragic loss of his closest friend did not threaten the necessary professional focus required to accomplish the job before him. As he slogged through the overwhelming logistics, his personal sadness was compounded by one disturbing realization. The situation before him was only worsening because one critical piece of paper had simply vanished. When George initially assumed his role as Rudy's estate executor, he believed the appointment would be a fairly straightforward assignment. He would simply liquidate all estate assets, pay all outstanding debts, and follow the terms of Rudy's last will and testament to the letter. Unfortunately for George and everyone concerned, Rudy's will generated nothing but confusion and discord from the moment the document was retrieved from his office safe at Falcon Lair. Rudy signed his last will and testament on September 1st, 1925, 1 year before his death. He executed this particular will a few weeks after his bitter separation from his second wife, Natasha, and the terms of the document reflected his emotional state of mind. In a blind rage, he instructed his attorney Raymond Stewart to draw up a new will to replace a previous will in which he bequeathed his entire estate to Natasha. In this new will, Rudy specified her inheritance as one thin dollar bill. Ignoring both his attorney and his manager's advice, Rudy proceeded to have the new will drawn up. It was also at this time he informed George that he planned to attach a sheet of instructions to the new will to further detail the execution of his final wishes. He then proceeded to relate verbally a few of these instructions to George. At the time, George perceived the new will as a vindictive and rash act, and believed Rudy would have another will drawn up as soon as his fury at Natasha subsided. Only 1 year later, George found himself in the throes of settling Rudy's estate, and sorely regretting that he never insisted upon reading a copy of the spiteful will or the attached sheet of specific instructions. His role as executor was seriously complicated when no such sheet of instructions could be located. George was confused as he studied the existing single page of the document and found no mention of Rudy's sheet of instructions other than a cryptic reference stating that his executor should dispense any estate income, quote, as I have this day instructed him, end quote. Consequently, during George's first days as executor, he spent considerable time rifling through Rudy's office files in a desperate search for the missing sheet of instructions. Determined to locate the document, he contacted the attorney who executed the will, Raymond Stewart, to see if he could shed some light upon the baffling situation. Attorney Stewart recalled drawing up a sheet of instructions at the same time Rudy executed his September 1925 last will and testament. He also told George that he had no copy of said instructions in his files, and in fact had little recollection of the specific terms of the document. He claimed the last he ever saw of the document in question was on the day he delivered the will to Rudy at Falcon Lair. At that time, he said, neither the will nor the attached sheet of instructions had been signed by Rudy or any witnesses. George grew frustrated when he could not locate what he believed to be a valid portion of Rudy's will. This left him no other option but to file the existing single-page document with the court. He also guaranteed his performance as executor by posting a personal $100,000 bond issued by the Independence Indemnity Company. Despite the fact that his authority as executor was considerably weakened by the vague terms of Rudy's will, George proceeded as best he could to carry out the business of settling the estate. The most immediate ramification of George's dilemma concerned the future of Rudy's production company, Rudolph Valentino Productions. As Rudy's business manager, George was the sole administrator of the production company and consequently the only person with any understanding of the inner workings of the complex business. In the initial weeks following Rudy's death, George was adamant that the production company remain operational as a potential means to generate future income for the estate. But as Rudy's one-page will made no mention of his production company and did not specify that his executor continued to act as its administrator in the event of his death, George was left grappling with too many unanswered questions. Had Rudy intended to authorize him to act as both executor of his estate and administrator of Rudolph Valentino Productions? Was George legally bound as executor to act upon his clear recollection of Rudy's oral instructions to him, specifying this dual authority? Or should he simply comply with the terms of the existing one-page will and act only as executor? Only after a thorough examination of the situation did George decide it would be in the best interest of the estate to act as estate executor and simultaneously continue in his role as head of Rudolph Valentino Productions. During this time, George faced one other troubling dynamic, contributing to the escalating tensions surrounding the settlement of Rudy's estate. Within a few weeks of Rudy's death, Alberto Valentino settled in Los Angeles, and his daily presence in executor George's life rapidly deteriorated from irksome nuisance to intolerable aggravation. The terms of Rudy's vague will became the flashpoints of the disintegrating relationship between the two men. If George found the one-page will confusing, brother Alberto would never have been able to interpret a single line of the document had it not been for Polanegri's immediate intervention. In sharp contrast to Alberto and George's increasingly hostile relationship, Alberto and Polanegri were becoming fast friends. Polanegri had taken her recently deceased lover's brother under her high-profile wing. She offered to assist him in any way possible and instructed her personal attorneys to facilitate Alberto's understanding of the fuzzy terms of Rudy's will. Alberto was relieved to learn his brother bequeathed Natasha the sum of $1, but was outraged at the news that George Ullman was named executor of the estate. Alberto was further peeved when he learned his brother designated a financial interest in the estate to two other people, his sister Maria Strada and Natasha's aunt Teresa Warner. There was one other clause in the will that Alberto did not apparently grasp. This was a provision stating that anyone contesting the will risked the reinstatement of the previous will, which bequeathed Rudy's entire estate to Natasha Rambova. Despite Polanegri's attorney's best advice, Alberto promptly contested Teresa Warner's claim to any share in Rudy's estate. Perhaps he was unaware that his brother did not name Teresa Warner in his will solely as a gesture of gratitude for the motherly role she played in his life. He included her in his will to ensure continued financial support for the beloved auntie in the event of his death. For during the last years of his life, Rudy instructed George to pay the monthly mortgage on Teresa Warner's Los Angeles home. Nevertheless, Alberto petitioned the court to strike Teresa Warner's name from the will and requested that he be appointed as estate executor. It was his wish, he informed the court, that George Ullman be removed from any administrative position over his brother's production company. Furthermore, he requested that the production company be immediately dissolved and all assets liquidated. The same day George received notification of Alberto's legal action, he dispatched a cable to Teresa Warner in France imploring her to return to Los Angeles at once to defend her interests in the will. Teresa Warner heeded George's advice and sailed for the U.S., arriving in Los Angeles on November 8th. The court denied every one of Alberto's requests and stung him with a painful reminder. By contesting his brother's will, he risked losing everything if Rudy's previous will was reinstated. Alberto could do little but accept the court's decision. In sore need of income, he began petitioning executor George for cash advances against what he presumed to be his future share of Rudy's estate. George accommodated Alberto's request by issuing checks drawn upon the Rudolph Valentino Production Company bank account. With each check, George reiterated to Alberto that one of those oral instructions Rudy shared with him directed him as executor to dispense only weekly stipends of estate funds to the 3 people mentioned in the will. Alberto vehemently replied that no such sheet of instructions ever existed, and pressed George for more cash advances. With no hard evidence to prove his claim, George continued to disperse estate funds as lump sums to not only to Alberto, but to the other 2 individuals mentioned in Rudy's existing will, his sister Maria Strada and Teresa Warner. These cash advances were not Alberto's only source of income. George became aware that he was removing items from his brother's property, Falcon Lair, and liquidating them into ready cash. This situation undermined George's efforts to conduct a comprehensive inventory of Rudy's personal belongings in advance of the estate auctions. 1 week earlier, on November 12th, he forwarded official legal notification to Alberto demanding the return of 2 items he removed from Falcon Lair: Rudy's dog K-Bar and Rudy's Franklin Coupe automobile. The fact that neither dog nor car had yet to be returned became just more fuel for the next volatile confrontation between Rudy's brother and one perturbed executor. Hollywood Jack's Steakhouse was located across the street from George's office on Santa Monica Boulevard. Every noon hour, the establishment's front doors were in constant motion as the daily power lunch crowd filed in. George considered the popular eatery his second office, with its high leather booths providing adequate privacy and the food being predictable fare. As he stepped through the swinging doors, he spotted his attorney Leonard Wilson, already seated in his regular booth. Wilson looked up and greeted his client with a "What's up?" George slid into the seat and gave him his answer. Alberto is about to lease a bungalow at the Ambassador and wants another $5,000 advance. A waiter paused to pour George a cup of coffee. "Tell him no," Wilson replied. Before George could respond, Alberto and his attorney Milton Cohen made their entrance. Their arrival silenced Hollywood Jack's customers as all heads turned towards the door in a collective stare. It wasn't that the steakhouse clientele recognized Alberto as Rudolph Valentino's brother. The freeze frame was in response to the formidable appearance of Rudy's prized Doberman K-Bar. The impressive animal stepped past waiters and onlookers, and as soon as he recognized George, he edged towards him for a pat. Alberto appeared oblivious to the stir generated by the mighty dog's arrival and tossed the leash on the floor to take a seat next to his attorney. While K-Bar flopped in a heap under the table, George wasted no time getting down to business by explaining to Alberto and Milton Cohen how Rudy's assets had not yet been liquidated and that cash was still in short supply. He then itemized a few of the latest invoices he'd just received for payment. "I opened invoices this morning for 40 suits Rudy ordered in London, and bills are still arriving from Paris and New York." As George raised his voice to be heard over the din of the lunch crowd, attorney Milton Cohen interrupted him. "We wish to know by what authority you are continuing to run Rudolph Valentino Productions, George. There is not a single reference in the will charging you in this respect. And where is this reference to your assertion that Rudy instructed you to dispense only weekly stipends to Alberto? In fact, we find the existing will so vague, we plan to have it stricken." George expected Cohen's offensive and leaned back in his seat to watch Alberto light one of Rudy's black tobacco cigarettes. Forging ahead with his own agenda, George continued to outline his plan to generate income for Rudy's production company by promoting his last two movies, The Son of the Sheik and The Eagle. He explained that he was in the process of mailing form letters to thousands of Rudy's fans who had written him a credible letter within the past year. This letter, he said, directed fans to form local groups or memorial guilds in Rudy's honor with the specific purpose of demanding that his last two movies be shown in local theaters. When George paused his explanation, Milton Cohen continued to expound upon the subject of Rudy's will. He repeated that there was no written evidence that Rudy ever charged George with the authority to manage his production company in the event of his death. He then threatened George by saying that if he did proceed to do so, he would object in court to all of his transactions in this capacity. George fought to control his temper and reminded Alberto and Milton Cohen that Rudy personally instructed him to continue managing Rudolph Valentino Productions. He said Rudy assured him he disclosed this provision on a second page of the will, which should have been attached to the original document. Throughout George's explanation, Alberto sat fuming and puffing away at his cigarette. Although he was still relatively unclear as to the daily operations of Rudolph Valentino Productions, he was well aware of one point. He despised George Ullman and his role in his brother's estate. When he reached his breaking point, he leaned across the table towards George. Ignoring his attorney's gesture to remain silent, Alberto demanded, "You show me the instructions." Leonard Wilson cut him off. "We have been unable to locate a copy of the instructions, Alberto, but the fact remains, if George does not continue to operate Rudolph Valentino Productions, you, sir, will soon have no further income to draw upon from the estate." Alberto reacted to this challenge by demanding that George write him a check for the $5,000 and guarantee his Ambassador Hotel bungalow. His booming voice prompted K-Bar to reposition himself under the table. George glowered into his cup of coffee and wondered if Rudy's passion for living far beyond his means might possibly have been genetic. He could not fathom how Alberto spent so much money in the few weeks since his arrival in Los Angeles. George looked up, returned Alberto's dirty look, and told him that all he could offer was a review of the production company's ledgers to see what reasonable amount he could advance. Alberto reacted to this news with an unexpected burst of fluency in English. "I will be in charge of my brother's business now." At this point the scene went public, and Alberto resorted to speaking in Italian by levying more charges, which neither the two attorneys nor George could understand. Milton Cohen took his cue and decided it was time to escort his client towards the door. George reacted to the sight of K-Bar trotting along behind the two men with his leash dragging on the floor by muttering, "That bastard." The noon crowd at Hollywood Jack's was not unaccustomed to an occasional fracas. After all, it was over these very tables that careers were made and destroyed, and some of the sweetest deals in Lotus Land were negotiated. So it was only a minute or two before Hollywood Jack's patrons lost all interest in the commotion. But George was steaming mad. How the hell can Alberto afford to pay a top-notch lawyer like Milton Cohen? Leonard Wilson reminded him that the highly paid celebrity attorney Milton Cohen also represented Pola Negri. George agreed her influence was not only apparent by Milton Cohen's presence, but in Alberto's request for the bungalow and requests for cash advances. George knew firsthand what little respect Pola had for money, especially when this lack of respect involved other people's money. He also knew the Valentino brothers were particularly vulnerable to her penchant for extravagance. George threw back the last of his coffee and told his attorney he didn't intend to devote another minute of his day to Alberto Valentino. With this said, he slapped the tab on the table and stormed out of Hollywood Jack's. It was a short walk across the street to his office, and Leonard Wilson kept pace as he tried to explain just how he would counter Alberto's objections in court. But George was distracted and barely listening to his attorney's suggestions. He could not shake the unsettling image of K-Bar, lumbering after Alberto with his leash rattling along the floor. 2 months later, January 1927. Malibu Colony is a narrow strip of coveted land wedged as a domino formation of premium beachfront properties. The decks of these lavish homes face west in order to afford homeowners a perfect view of each evening's blazing sunset. Although one or two storms occasionally blew in off the Pacific to challenge the precarious structures, these were rare occasions. One would be hard-pressed to find a more idyllic spot in which to languish in a sea breeze and bask in the salt air. The deck of Pola Negri's Malibu beach house was the one place she could find solace and sit obscured from the view of casual passerbys on the beach below. During the winter months, she often sat, cloaked in a flannel blanket, to take refuge on a deck chair and gaze at the horizon. On one chilly day, she returned from her work at the studio to again keep watch from her deck and lose herself in contemplation. Southern Californians never spent such cold days outdoors, but Pola Negri grew up on the streets of Warsaw, and she found the brisk air downright balmy. Pola was a woman with only a passing acquaintance with emotional restraint, and on that day she again anguished, feeling misunderstood by the press and Rudy's fans. On January 7th, she submitted a claim of $15,000 against his estate. At the time, she informed the press she loaned Rudy this amount of money some time before his death and claimed her request for payment was only to give every cent to his brother Alberto. She explained her generosity by stating that Alberto assured her he intended to use the $15,000 to bring his wife and 12-year-old son Gene from Italy so they might live with him in Los Angeles. But despite Pola's best attempt at clarification, the public's response to her request from Rudy's estate was less than favorable. As soon as she received George's check for the full amount, she did pass the money along to Alberto. To Pola's distress, he made no move to bring the family to Los Angeles. Meanwhile, the press had a field day at her expense with their negative implications. If she really loved Rudy, they alleged, she would never have demanded his estate reimburse her for a personal loan. In the wake of this publicity, she began to grasp the larger picture of just where she stood with Rudy's fans. Most of them hated her, and not only disapproved of her claim against his estate, but believed she was exploiting his death to gain publicity. As the foghorns droned on across the Pacific Ocean, Pola sank further into her torment, and on that gray winter day she lost her struggle to ignore the public's opinion of her actions. She watched the surf break and recede, tucked her blanket around her legs, and tended to her brooding. At some point she heard her secretary, Florence Hines, speaking with Alberto Valentino as he arrived at the beach house. They exchanged a few words before he stepped out onto the deck to greet Pola in his heavy Italian accent. "I'm going to be a movie star. They tell me I will take Rudolfo's place in movies." Pola responded with a blank stare. "Doing exactly what, Alberto?" "I have spoken with Silvano Balboni, June Mathis's husband. He told me the public idolizes your brother. It will receive you with open arms in pictures. You look like him all but your nose. I ask him what must be done. I have my nose. I have no other. Perhaps you tell me how to change it. I asked him, and he told me plastic surgery." Despite Alberto's visible excitement, Pola tried to think of a fast and tactful way to tell him that the whole idea of plastic surgery was crazy. "Have you told Allman about this?" she asked. "And when is Gene coming from Italy? Have you made the arrangements?" Alberto ignored the first question. "Gene is in school in Turin. He will stay there." During the weeks prior to Rudy's 2 estate auctions, one held in December in Los Angeles and a second in January in San Francisco, George conducted an extensive inventory of Rudy's estate, published an expensive, slickly produced catalog, and made every effort to maximize every sale. He held high expectations that the public auctioning of Rudy's homes, his custom-built automobiles, his horses, pedigreed dogs, and hundreds of personal belongings would fetch a handsome return which could promptly be deposited in the bank. During this busy time, George retained Falcon Lairs handyman Lou Mahoney on the Rudolph Valentino production company payroll, and assigned him the task of organizing the auction's inventory both at Falcon Lair and at the production company's prop house on Santa Monica Boulevard. As George endeavored to increase the value of some of the items on the auction block, he instructed Lou to bring Rudy's yacht into dry dock for a fresh coat of paint, and even resorted to stamping Rudy's signature inside a few of his rare books to increase their value by a few dollars. In order to ensure further top-dollar returns, George also invested estate funds in the restoration of Rudy's antique collections. Despite all of his and Lou's efforts, bids at the first auction in Los Angeles were far below reasonable asking prices, and the event was a thoroughly depressing experience for George. Even a substantial bid made on Falcon Lair failed to result in the final sale of the property, as the prospective owner did not provide a satisfactory cash deposit. At the time, the motion picture industry was only decades old, and collecting celebrity memorabilia was still a new concept. Whether Rudolph Valentino owned an item or not often held little sway over a prospective buyer's decision. The sale of Rudy's belongings was not only professionally discouraging for George, but privately heart-wrenching. He had been present during those happier days when Rudy, the avid collector, enthusiastically filled his home with antique armor, tapestries, furniture, and art. Initially, George hoped all of the collections would find appreciative owners, but he was barely able to give some of the valuable items away at any price. His frustration with the modest success of the Los Angeles auction was further compounded by Alberto's intense interest in the speedy liquidation of his brother's belongings. As estate executor, George realized all of Rudy's possessions, no matter how insignificant their value, were legally the property of his estate. But his efforts as executor to enforce this technicality were at best sporadic, and for a while sentiment prevailed over the legal protocols of estate settlement. When Rudy's sister Maria Strada arrived from Italy in January, George drove her to Falcon Lair and stood by as she sorted through her brother's remaining personal effects. Among the other items she selected were Rudy's emerald and platinum cufflinks, an emerald ring, a sapphire ring, his white gold cigarette case, and an amber and sapphire cigarette holder appraised at $3,428. Legally, George never should have permitted her to remove a single sock from the premises, but motivated by sympathy, he said nothing, as Maria selected many more valuable items from her brother's last home. It was not long before George realized this gesture set precedence for an escalation in the removal of item after item by everyone concerned. Even George kept items he considered of insignificant market value. Rudy's personal and business address books, a small oil landscape painted by Rudy, stacks of photographs and letters, and other artifacts, as well as random pieces of furniture. With Lou Mahoney's assistance, Maria shipped her estate items to her home in Italy. And on one occasion George watched as Alberto slipped a small tin box full of Rudy's jewelry into his coat pocket. George was not sure how many pieces of jewelry were in this container, but he did know it was a sizable cache of some 50 items, including Rudy's favorite platinum wristwatch. Alberto also boxed up and carted away all of Rudy's clothing, including his suits, riding boots, and hats. Even Lou Mahoney had a hand in removing property, including lace and Pola Negri's lingerie, which his wife later stitched into fancy dresses for their daughter. This haphazard disbursement of Rudy's personal effects only served to widen the feud between George and Alberto, with the inevitable questions being bandied about as to who took what, when, and where. Accusations were soon flying, and a profound and irrevocable distrust between the two men set in. By the end of January 1927, as Rudy's second estate auction was held at the Curtis Studios in San Francisco, George and Alberto were no longer meeting face-to-face and were communicating only through their attorneys. In the hopes of selling a few more items remaining on the auction block, George extended the San Francisco estate auction for several days. When sales continued to be unremarkable, he made the decision to call an end to the peddling of Rudy's wares. On the final day of the San Francisco sale, he informed the auction house that the public auctioning would terminate at the close of that business day. With the total sales from both auctions at barely $100,000, George faced the grim reality of exploring other options to pay Rudy's enormous debt, while somehow continuing to generate future income for his estate. As George concluded his last day of business in the Curtis studios, the considerable weight of his situation left him exhausted and discouraged. Clearing Rudy's debt was not his only immediate concern. Rudy's sister Maria had decided to remain in Los Angeles for a few weeks and was hiring her own attorneys. George also knew that Alberto had recently retained several new lawyers who were already flooding his office in Los Angeles with more legal documents. Brushing aside these stressful thoughts of the Guglielmi's proliferating legal muscle, George prepared for his return trip home to Los Angeles. He was set to board the next southbound train out of San Francisco, and would soon be spending time in the backyard of his Foothill Drive home in Beverly Hills with his 9-year-old son Danny and 4-year-old son Bobby. As George handed the auctioneer's clerk his shipping instructions, he realized the disheartening business of auctioning Rudy's estate was officially over. "That's it," he told the clerk. "Have all of this shipped to the prop house in Los Angeles." As soon as the clerk stamped a final seal on the day's receipts, George chucked the fistful of papers into his briefcase and stepped out onto Sutter Street to hail the first passing cab. The cabbie was a burly fellow, puffing away on a stump of a cigar. George settled back in his seat. 3rd and Townsend, the Southern Pacific station. The taxicab careened through traffic with a few harrowing near misses, but George was so lost in thought he barely noticed. There were too many bills to pay, too many mouths to feed, and Alberto and Maria were mobilizing more attorneys in Los Angeles. At that prospect, George removed his flask from his overcoat pocket and swallowed a long swig of warm bourbon. "Old story," he mused aloud. The cabbie turned his head and uttered a guttural, "Huh?" "It's an old story," George repeated. "It's the same old story that took place in Italy some 100 years ago, after a man named Guglielmi got into a row with a fellow by the name of Colonna. Their beef turned violent, and Guglielmi ended up killing his archenemy Colonna." The cabbie motored on as George related the rest of his tale. "The way I was told, it was after Colonna's murder, sometime around the year 1850, when brigands raided the Rudolph Valentino family's hideaway and forced them to move to a village in southern Italy called Castellaneta." The cabbie chomped on his cigar and glanced into his rearview mirror. "Valentino?" he asked. "The sheik?" "Yeah," George sighed. "One and the same." For the remainder of the ride, George sat in silence. Between sips of bourbon, he strategized just how he would clear Rudy's enormous debt, which by then had reached a staggering total of $300,000. Despite this overwhelming prospect, the bootleg spirit strengthened his resolve to arrive in Los Angeles, spend a day with his boys, and then renew his drive to turn the balance sheet of Rudy's estate right side up. As the cabbie wended his way south on 3rd Street, George stared out the window. He could not help but notice more downtrodden have-nots loitering in the streets instead of the well-dressed haves of San Francisco's financial district. This visible specter of poverty and failure threatened his bourbon-inspired confidence, and as the cab pulled up to the Southern Pacific station, he removed the flask from his coat pocket and threw back a few more gulps. By the time he boarded the Southern Pacific that afternoon, he was sufficiently lit and feeling invincible. And as he settled into his seat for the long ride home, he savored thoughts of his impending success as Rudy's executor and of that long-overdue telephone call to Natasha. Thanks for listening, and my next installment will be Chapter 4, titled Babykins. I hope you will subscribe to this podcast so you will be notified when the next chapter goes online. And as always, you may find your copy of Affairs Valentino on Amazon and all online book-selling venues.